So, Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, there is a new terrifying development in the expansion of the surveillance state. When you think of the Capitol Police, you probably think of them as the police department for the Capitol complex in Washington, D.C. You might not even realize that the Capitol had its own police force before the events of January 6th. Now, what makes the United States Capitol Police Agency interesting is its jurisdiction. The USCP was actually created by the legislative branch of government. It's a federal agency, and its task is to protect the members of Congress, officers of Congress, and their families. Besides protecting the Capitol complex, which is about 2 square miles, the Capitol Police can also be found in the 200 blocks surrounding the complex, ensuring its security. But their jurisdiction doesn't stop there. As long as they are performing protective functions over members of Congress and their families, which is a very broad definition, they actually have jurisdiction throughout the entirety of the United States. Yes, the USCP is another federal law enforcement agency. And guess what? They just announced their expansion. The Capitol Police are opening up field offices for the first time in San Francisco and Tampa with the intention of adding more cities very soon. What is the purpose? They say they need to be out in the field to investigate threats to Congress. And apparently, according to the agency, deep blue San Francisco and moderately liberal Tampa have the highest concentrated number of these threats that apparently need Capitol Police investigation. Now, typically, these types of investigations are handled by the FBI, but the USCP, with their newly expanded budget, thanks to Democrats overly funding the police, have found themselves with enough cash to expand to the states. Not only that, but the agency also has secured from the Department of Defense military-grade surveillance equipment. The new PSSGM units the agency acquired provides high-definition surveillance video and are enabled with night vision. Apparently, the data from these devices can be combined with sensor data to create a pattern of life analysis on suspects. Now, what else do they have? Not sure. Speaking to the Washington Times, a Capitol officer said, quote, "Hopefully you can understand it wouldn't be smart of us to tell the world all of our capabilities." So who are the suspects and why will some people be targeted? Well, we may never know because the Capitol Police are technically a part of the legislative branch. They are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. That's right. You can request transparency from the CIA, the Secret Service, the FBI, and every other law enforcement agency except the Capitol Police. So now we have a federal law enforcement agency with an overbloated budget and military-grade spy equipment that's expanding to its offices throughout the country with zero transparency. Does anyone see the problem here? And it gets worse. The Capitol Police Chief reports to the Capitol Police Board. The Capitol Police Board is made up of 3 people, the Senate and House Sergeants at Arms and the Architect of the Capitol. Both of the Sergeant at Arms are appointed and report to the leaders of their respective chambers. So as you work your way up the chain of command, you end up with the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. This means currently Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are indirectly or maybe directly in charge of the police force with zero transparency, spy gear, and jurisdiction everywhere. Now, those of you on the left saying, yeah, but those right-wingers need to be investigated, look at what they did. Remember when I said the first 2 field offices are in liberal San Francisco and Tampa? The surveillance state is more often than not used on liberals who look to append the hyper-capitalist, elitist-run society than anyone else. And it's not that I'm afraid of Nancy and Chuck in particular. It could be any 2 hyper-partisan leaders from either party abusing the power of their newly expanded partisan secret police guard. Today, it's the left who are hunting right-wing QAnon conspiracy theorists, but who will it be tomorrow? The expansion of these agencies and power is never temporary. This is the beginning of Patriot Act 2.0, and it stems from the narrative that dangerous insurrectionists are an imminent threat to our democracy. You know, Ryan, I just see this as another threat of weapons of mass destruction as, being used to expand the surveillance state. I mean, that's my big fear with this.
Yeah, it's an incredibly destructive potential. I think you're very right to put your finger on it. The idea that the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader would have these sophisticated armies at their disposal should be really disturbing to people. I mean, let's say you have a Speaker of the House who is, of course, by nature, they're a very political creature. If they wanted to infiltrate some type of protest movement in the opposition party, they could then direct the Capitol Police to say, look, we've been getting threats from this organization, whether it's a Tea Party group or it's Black Lives Matter. And so we need to infiltrate this group, and so that we can root out the people that are making these threats to us. And then once they've infiltrated an organization, what the FBI has shown over and over is that you can then convince that organization to start doing things, like with these clowns in Michigan. You had like a dozen federal agents and assets who were part of this conspiracy who were like, yeah, Whitmer is really bad. We should kidnap her, shouldn't we? And people are like, I don't know about that. And then other assets and agents are like, yeah, we should totally do that. And then next thing you know, everybody's on board. So that's just one foreseeable consequence of this expansion of a posse that is operating at the behest of a speaker and a majority leader. But you could easily think of lots of other ways that the wheels could come off of this.
Well, and especially the fact that we don't have any transparency with them. I mean, they're not subject to any sort of, we can't inquire as citizens to find out who are you investigating, why is this going on, what is happening, any transparency. They're not subject to it because of the way they were formed, by being formed directly under the legislative branch. They're technically a part of the legislative branch, and so they're not subject to any of that. So that is extremely alarming. I think that the vast majority of people do not realize the power of Capitol Police. And really, we've never really had to think much about it because we just assume that they're just surrounding the Capitol complex. But the fact that they're now, they announced about a month ago that they wanted to expand their offices. And then just the other day, they actually told us where, right? They said, we're going to do it in California and in Florida. And now they're saying, well, it's actually now we're San Francisco and Tampa. And they're going to be expanding those offices with surveillance, military-grade equipment, and no transparency, and like you said, and at the behest of the legislative branch, the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. Now, that might not be so scary when they're from two different parties, but when they are from the same party, and especially now, when they're talking about, look at these insurrectionists at the Capitol building, and they're using January 6th, and that is my big beef with the entire discussion around January 6th, is that this is leading to the new Patriot Act. This is the new war on terror. It's the new war on domestic terror. And they're using this narrative. And look, I'm not downplaying what happened at the Capitol. It was bad. The storming of the Capitol was bad. There's no doubt about that. Those people need to suffer consequences, the ones that committed illegal acts. But to allow this to then spin out of control, once the expansion of this power happens, there's no getting it back. There's no reeling this back in. Right.
And what they're attempting to do here wouldn't have done anything about January 6th. And that's always, how these expansions play out. There's some modest or small failure somewhere that leads to some major crisis. And then they use that crisis then to expand in ways that had nothing to do with the original failure. So, in other words, it was well publicized that there was going to be a giant rally on January 6th in Washington, D.C. There have been giant rallies in Washington, D.C. going back, to the bonus army coming to, after World War I. And Washington, D.C., knows how to handle these giant rallies. You just put an extra couple layers of security around the buildings that you want to protect. Instead, and this is why the commission is important, it was like a normal Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday in Washington, D.C. A couple of guys at each door and a couple of those little bike racks that they put around the Capitol. And so when all they needed to do was call in some people for overtime to prevent this from happening, to then say, oh, well, actually what we need is offices in Tampa and San Francisco and expand around the country.
You're right, and military-grade spy equipment.
Right.
We need all of this stuff. I mean,
you just needed to read Facebook.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's very, very alarming. And I think everybody should be alarmed by this. And I think everybody should also kind of think about the rhetoric surrounding January 6th and say, listen, if our rhetoric, if the public is showing alarm and continuing to say, oh, my gosh, this was the worst thing that's happened to our country since the Civil War. I mean, we're hearing these sorts of, phrases from people. People need to understand that sort of rhetoric is what's giving them power to be doing these sorts of expansions, to justify these expansions. It's particularly hypocritical that this is coming from Democrats mostly that are saying, defund the police or we want to scale back on police. And then they expand. They overly bloated the Capitol Police budget. And now look at what they're allowing the Capitol Police to do as a federal agency. And so people do need to, I think about these words. When we talk about things ad nauseum, it just gives these lawmakers power to do things rather than putting that money towards things that are actually going to help the American people.
And it's good you're saying this now, because one piece of good news is that even though half of the squad caved to allow this $1.9 billion to go through, the Senate still hasn't come to an agreement on what that package is going to look like. So with enough pressure, this could still be rolled back. We'll see if
potentially,
it happens.
right? Yeah. But they're still, in their expansion phases. And I mean, it's really crazy. So, Ryan, really looking forward to your radar.
You got it.